revisit the content from your own childhood through the lens of, I cannot believe this was okay at the time. It is bonding. Sometimes your kid will be the one to say to you, are you kidding that this was okay?
Hi, Cara.
Well, hello, Vanessa.
We got a really interesting listener question, actually via SpeakPipe on our website. We're so high tech. So we got a recording of it.
It's where someone speaks into a pipe.
Haha. The sort of overview of the question came from a parent who has noticed what she described as sexual harassment in middle school. And she talked about the language kids are using, the trend of pantsing, which sadly is not new, but has been going on for a long time. You can listen to the episode with my brother where he talks about being pantsed as a middle schooler. This listener also talks about backshotting, which may be new to people. It's something that characters or avatars in Roblox do, and it's where a player moves their avatar behind another player to sort of simulate a sexual act, and apparently middle schoolers are starting to do that in person as well. And so her question was, how do we talk about it with our kids? And also, how do we handle our own past experiences and maybe even our own trauma as we think about handling this really complicated topic with our children?
You know, we're going to get into all the details of this, but I want to point people to a bunch of different resources that we have. We can repoint you throughout the episode and at the end as well as you follow along. We'll give you some more specific suggestions, but we do have a lot of this content available, Vanessa, in the Less Awkward Hub. There is a section in our course called Less Awkward University that is focused on all sorts of topics around consent. And we specifically, in the high school content that we've created most recently, we specifically get into consent that is sexual consent, which sort of abuts sexual harassment. So while we don't have a specific sexual harassment module, there's a ton of content in there about how to talk to kids about a number of these issues. Because as you so often describe, and I think this is the important way of approaching this topic, information really needs to be addressed in sort of this spiral form where one begins in a broad way and starts getting increasingly more specific, not in a single conversation necessarily, but in many, many conversations over time. So for those who feel a little overwhelmed and sort of don't know where to start, and even at the end of this episode, if you're feeling like, gosh, I wish I had some paths through, I encourage you to check that out. But let's get into this specific question.
So to begin, we're going to start with some definitions of some of the phrases that the listener used and will use throughout this conversation. These definitions are pulled from our high school, school-based curriculum called That Health Class. These lessons were written with contributions from the incredible educator, Shafia Zaloom, who is like the consent queen. I mean, she's just so well respected and so understands the reality of kids' lives. She's an educator. She's an educator of high school kids. She teaches on the college level. She's written books. So we are super grateful to have her contributions and her as a sounding board on these really complicated topics. And to Cara's point about, if we think about, okay, this is a question that originated from things that are happening in schools, the concept of a spiral of revisiting topics over and over again with increasing sophistication, that is true at home. That is also very true at schools. So if you look at our curriculum, consent is covered in every single year. And in high school, it's covered in a variety of ways because our high school curriculum is not by grade. It's actually by sort of topical thematic buckets. So we have tons of content about consent in high school, and in K through 8, every grade has a version of a consent lesson. So we're going to start with a definition of the term the listener used, which is sexual harassment. And the definition we use in our curriculum is that it is repeated and unwanted verbal and physical sexual attention. So that can be anything from sexual jokes to unsolicited sexual texts to derogatory language that is sexual, misogynistic, homophobic, and unwanted touching of private parts like chests, crotches, butts, the parts of the body that are private to people. And there may be other parts of the body that some people feel private that are not on this list, but would be considered a violation of privacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to insert the or in that definition. I think it's really important because the list makes it very clear that verbal sexual attention is a form of sexual harassment. Separate from that, unwanted touching is a form of sexual harassment. And here's why this is really significant, Vanessa. The definition of harassment has shifted over time in the zeitgeist. When we were growing up, what is now called harassment was, by and large, considered acceptable humor or acceptable sort of teasing and prodding. It was harassment then. Like, I think it's really important to be clear. It's not that what it was changed. It's the way we have come to see it as a society. And the reason this is important is that the consequences for kids looked different then than they do now. So, you and I get a lot of incoming from people all over the country describing things that are happening in their schools or community. And kids are asked to leave schools, after school programs, community groups on account of sexual harassment. That, I believe, was essentially a never event. I mean, it was a very, very, very rare occurrence when we were growing up. And I would say, based upon what we hear from people, it's not that it's, super common, but I would not call it rare anymore.
Right. So the times have shifted, and it's important to be aware of it. I mean, we, lived through the Me Too movement. And while in some ways it feels like that was like an incredible sort of move forward, in some ways it feels like our society has moved back. But in the communities that we find ourselves, the schools we partner with, that is not the case. That these communities and these schools take this very seriously, no matter what's happening in the sort of larger zeitgeist of our culture. Another phrase that's important to define is the term coercion. This is actually a term that high schoolers know. It may feel sort of very specific or legalistic, but it is a term they use and know. We define it as using pressure and power to force someone to do something sexual that's against their will. So everything from verbal badgering to physical force, right? And to Cara's point, this is an or list. This is not a cumulative must check all the boxes list. So ignoring objections to doing something sexual, or guilting someone, or using social power to get them to do something, or manipulation, or physically overpowering them, coercing them that way. So those are all forms of coercion. You'll notice there's some overlap with sexual harassment, and you'll notice as we move to definition of sexual assault, there's some overlap there. So coercion is sort of a subcategory in this conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's a pretty gray zone trying to tease apart terms like coercion and manipulation, or coercion. I like the word badgering because it's one form of coercion that feels more obvious. It feels more seeable. When I think about coercion, I think about more stealthy coercion, like when someone is being manipulated. I mean, that's really the
How
concept,
about
right?
I'm going to break up with you if you don't have sex with me?
That's right. Or if you don't send more nudes, I am going to share this image that I already have of you wide, right?
Right.
So this is
a broad and complex topic, but it's not an unknown topic to young people.
and it's not unknown because coercion exists outside
Mhm.
of sex and sexual dynamics and is actually, I mean, I would say when I look back on my upbringing with 3 brothers, coercion was a huge part of my life in a completely non-sexual way. I was literally convinced, strong-armed, noogied until I was willing to participate in all sorts of antics with my brothers. So coercion pre-exists their conversations around sex and sexuality. They understand this concept.
Right.
They really do.
I remember having a conversation with a friend and her kid was, maybe like 10 or 11, and he kept negotiating about stuff and he kept badgering her. It was about screen time or dinner or, going to Dave and Buster's. I don't remember. But she was worried that the modeling she set up around badgering and negotiation at that age would somehow inform or dictate his sense of what was appropriate in a sexual or intimate relationship. And she felt the pressure to nip in the bud the badgering and negotiation then, so that as he grew older and was in other settings, that he didn't see it as a kind of acceptable way of getting someone to do what he wanted them to do, which I thought was amazing foresight on her part.
Right. Although, if I'm a parent listening to this right now, it also can feel a little overwhelming. Like, oh, was I supposed to connect those dots? And it's okay if you didn't.
Correct. Correct. My being impressed with her was because it was something I hadn't thought about or done with my own children. Just so we're super clear, that's where I was like super impressed.
Yeah, that's very high level.
Right. And then the last, and this is not an episode about sexual assault, teen dating, violence, rape. But we have to define that also in relationship to these other topics. So sexual assault is unwelcome sexual contact that occurs without explicit consent. So it's unwanted touching or sexual contact with someone who's unable to give consent, right? They've been using substances, maybe they're not even conscious, or rape. And rape is non-consensual penetration of a body with a body part or another item. So it doesn't have to be a body part. There are sadly other versions of rape that use things other than a body part.
And so, Vanessa, is it fair to say that in the same way that all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares, sexual assault must be physical? It must be tangible. Therefore, all sexual assault falls under the umbrella of sexual harassment. But all sexual harassment is not sexual assault.
Correct.
Yeah. And that's why we're not going to focus too much on sexual assault in this episode. We're going broader and we want to have the broader conversation. I'm having a moment. I don't know if you do this often, but I'm having a moment where I'm flashing back to the series of movies that I watched growing up.
Oh my God, I know.
Right. And, in service to that question, does it hold up, is really the other question, which is, oh my God, would that ever be allowed to be shown today? I mean, the degree of sexual harassment that was sort of a plot through line in TV shows and films that we grew up on, it's really kind of remarkable. I'm just like, I don't know why, I've got this whole ticker running through my head.
I mean, how about the scene in 16 Candles where Molly Ringwald and Anthony Michael Hall are sitting in the mechanic shop and he goes to make out with her, which she rejects. And then he somehow convinces her to give him a pair of her underwear.
And by the way, like, for what it's worth, 16 Candles was my favorite movie of all time.
100%. It's so offensive in so many ways. And yet I'm like, it's so woven into my brain and my
Right.
identity and my reference points to my youth that it's like, I feel terrible. And also there's nothing I can do about
And
it.
then I'm thinking about movies that were so ahead of their time. 9 to 5. 9 to 5
Oh my God.
was, I mean, that movie, first of all, the song, come on.
I know.
But it really was about women who were not going to take sexual harassment anymore.
Right.
Right? The belittling.
In the workplace.
In the workplace, right? And it was not a social commentary. I mean, maybe it was, and I was just too young to understand. But like, I think it was really what it was, is it was just way in front of its time. It was
Dolly Parton, Jane Fonda, Lily Tomlin.
Oh yeah.
Right? Okay.
Yeah. And who played the boss? Oh,
and look at
Dabney Coleman.
Dabney Coleman. And look at what those women have gone on to do decades and decades later, still making change, still out ahead of the curve.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
So yes, there were those also. So with all those definitions and sort of the caveats and the sort of contextualizing, let's answer the question, which is kind of broken out into a few parts. One is, if you know this stuff is going on in your kid's school, how do you work in partnership with the school, right? It's like you hear about stuff that happens in the lunchroom or during recess or at pickup, or maybe it's not happening on school grounds, but it's happening with the other kids at school. And it's a really tricky question that we hear parents grappling with all the time, which is like, when do I step in? How do I step in? Who's the person I speak to? All of those tough questions.
Well, and there are a couple of things that I think you have to start with. And the first is this list of definitions, because you could describe a scenario like pantsing. And I'd be willing to bet some large number of parents would be like, it's really not a big deal. Pantsing was a thing when I was growing up. Like, why are we making such a big deal out of this? So understanding the shifting context and understanding why it wasn't okay then and it's not okay now is actually really, really important. And that sounds super Pollyanna, and I don't mean to be that way, but like, we need to teach our kids what violations of other people's privacy bubbles and comfort zones and physical space look like. And it starts with something as a sort of old school, if you will, as pantsing. So I think those definitions become very important. The other thing that becomes very important is understanding how parenting style layers onto this concept of, I don't really know what's going on at school. And what I mean by that is, pick your title of parent who's very enmeshed with their kid, helicopter snowplow, like whatever you want to call it, right? It is incumbent upon us as trusted adults of these kids to allow them to individuate, to allow them to separate. A part of that is entrusting to the school that the school will be in open conversation with us, that the school will have eyes on a situation. There is a gigantic hole that can open up, like a gigantic black hole, where there just isn't enough supervision. There aren't enough adults. Things happen at recess, whatever it is. And you're stuck with this story that comes home from your kid. And what do you do as the trusted adult? Do you blindly believe your kid? My kid's story's right. I'm going to call the school. I'm going to get to the bottom of it. My kid's right. Everyone's wrong. Do you go the opposite, where you think, this is not possible? If this happened to my kid at school, wouldn't the school report? And then sort of take a different approach? Or do you, and I'm like teeing it up because obviously the right answer is the middle ground, but like, do you start to try to figure out how to solve the mystery of what happened when you didn't have eyes on a situation?
There's also the flip side, which is educators say to us, hey, we spend all day navigating this in the school context as best as we can.
That's right.
We need the parents to take some ownership of this stuff in the off hours, right? So it really is a true It needs to be a true
Well, say more about
partnership.
that, Vanessa. Say more about what it looks like for parents to take ownership in the off hours.
Right. So we're going to get to what families can do at home. So if we take the example of backshotting, which sounds like it's happening in school, right? Kids are going up behind other kids and sort of simulating a sexual act. That's stuff that they're seeing when they're at home on Roblox during, over the weekend or during their screen time. Parents may not be aware of what their kids are seeing online. And it's our responsibility as parents to be aware of what kind of content our kids are being exposed to and how it impacts their behavior, no matter where they are, right? Whether they're at school or at home or in the playground or whatever. So that's one example of sharing responsibility. I mean, we hear from teachers all the time, in the context of like sex ed, a lot of parents just want us to handle it because it's such an awkward conversation. And if you listen to this podcast, you know that teaching kids about sex is a responsibility of kind of many, many trusted adults in many contexts, because you never know what's going to help, what's going to work. So to Cara's point, it's a hard balance to strike, particularly with middle school kids. And then as they move into high school, because you're both like, hey, my kid is individuating. I want them to have some independence and have a separate identity. And yet they're still very much in formation, and we have to have eyes on them either as educators or as parents. And so it's like there can be kind of this chasm of who's in charge. I just want to make a point about reactive, right?
Yes.
How do I know? Was it my kid? Did they do it? Did it happen to them, right? There's a lot of sort of litigating of these things. But the most important thing, really, and this is not if there is an act that is deeply violates the safety of a child, but if there's sort of stuff going on, that means the schools need to do a better job of educating the students about what is sexual harassment, what is consent, right? They're creating a school culture that requires a really deep foundation of education on these topics, because if it's happening and there are no consequences or nobody's aware of it or there aren't eyes on it, that means the school is not doing what they need to be doing to create a safe atmosphere for their students.
Yeah, but you said something earlier that I think it cannot be buried. And let's just shine a big spotlight on it, which is it's not all on the schools.
No.
But it's not all on the schools. And to your point, think about bell-to-bell phone bans in schools, right? We hear this a lot from educators and administrators. They're doing their part to have kids put away their devices. Kids go home, and what they really need for long-term success is for parents to also do their part, helping kids dial back their device use. In the exact same way, I just want to make sure to shine a very, very bright light on your comment. There has to be consistency and through line and partnership between the schools and the parents. If what's happening and being enforced in school is different from what is happening and being enforced at home, you have a kid whose brain is mid-development who gets really confused. And
right.
all
no,
they
my
learn,
point is just that the parents have certain responsibility, but schools have,
yes,
in the school day, have a responsibility to create a safe environment for students. So if kids are being backshotted in the hallways at school, that is a violation. That should be a violation of school rules. That should be made clear to the students. There should be consequences for a kid who violates that rule. And there needs to be education about sexual harassment, about consent. We'll get to the parent side of things, which I 100% agree. As I mentioned earlier, parents bear a lot of responsibility too. But ultimately, if kids are not feeling safe in school, they cannot succeed. They cannot learn, which is their job at school. And there's tons of data about the importance of kids feeling safe at school. So schools need the partnership of parents. They need clear rules and consequences about the kinds of things that can happen in the hallways and the lunchroom and in the bathrooms and all of those. And they need ongoing education about consent, right? As we mentioned earlier, it needs to get increasingly in depth and sophisticated as these kids get older. One lesson in 7th grade does not do it, right? This is an ongoing
That's right.
need.
You know, it's an interesting dilemma for some schools on the topic of consequences. So I completely agree with you that clarity of rules and follow through on consequences is the only way that kids feel safe and that they learn. But I've heard from a number of teachers and administrators over the years that what they struggle with is also that mistakes and poor decision making are very much a part of growing up. And sometimes it gets tricky. Like, how do you enforce a rule in a rigid way without allowing for any room for error? Or, as seen through the lens of kids, sometimes they'll say, it's so unfair because so and so gets in trouble for everything and so doesn't get in trouble for anything. And the consequences for one action seem to be different for two different kids. And to that point, I would just say it is such an interesting conversation to bring up with your school and understand why they make certain rules and understand sort of the origin seed of what they're doing, mostly because chances are their rules come from a long history of understanding how kids behave and why, but also because it puts you in conversation with your school and they might learn from you.
Yeah. I mean, if there are any educators or administrators who'd like to come on and talk about the really complicated dance of figuring some of this out, on the one hand, acknowledging the ways in which young people make really crappy decisions and not maliciously sometimes, and how you square that with your community, your handbook, your community rules, your disciplinary actions, all of those things. So I want to get to this listener question, which becomes more personal, which is like, how do we talk about it? How do we handle it in our homes? For her question about sort of our own trauma and past experiences, I want to point people to our episode with Melissa Kilbride, who's a mental health professional. Her handle is Askable Mama on Instagram, and her specialty is really around sex education and trauma. And the episode she did with us goes in real depth on this topic. So we will point you out to that episode to address this question. We're really going to focus on how do we set boundaries in our homes. To Cara's point earlier, like, it's on us too. We have a lot of responsibility. How do we partner with schools? How do we convey our values to our kids so that they are out in the world behaving in a way that reflects those values, not just under our roof? And I'll start, Cara, and then, please dive in. So the first thing I would say is, as young as you can, having clear and ongoing conversations about consent in your home, right? Not just about sex when they get older into middle school and high school and beyond, but about everything, right? Can I borrow your clothes? Can I have a bite of your sandwich? Do you want to have a pillow fight? Can I tickle you? Right? All of the things that are sort of a natural part of living with someone else, sharing space with someone else, having fun with someone else, having conflict with someone else, right? Those are all opportunities for ongoing conversations about consent. If that's something you haven't already started doing in your home, this is a great opportunity to do it. If it's something you did do when they were younger and now it gets a little trickier, time to revisit it. But it is an ongoing mandate and opportunity for us to cover consent in our own families.
So here's a common question that I get as a pediatrician, and it speaks to exactly this. You've got two siblings and they are school age. Maybe they're young school age, first, second grade, third grade, and they still run around naked. And they might even bathe or shower at the same time. And they roughhouse and they grab each other in ways that, sexual harassment, would be the first on a list of things that were going on. Were they not siblings? And they're not asking for consent in the moment. They are sibling roughhousing, fooling around, clearly joyful, silly until, someone cries.
Right.
But Vanessa, this is a scenario we get all the time. And I'm curious to know, sort of how you would point people through, or I'm happy to share sort of how I would point people through that dynamic and how to be internally consistent. If that's what's going on in your home and school is trying to teach about sexual harassment, this gets confusing. So I think it's okay to unbraid these threads. And I don't know if you want to take a stab at it or if you want me to take a stab at it.
Yeah, I mean, so with respect to the sort of bathing together, running around naked, there will come a point where one or both of the children will just say, I don't want to bathe with them anymore. I don't want to see them naked. I don't want them topless at the breakfast table, whatever it is. The kids will start to advocate for themselves. And that's the point at which you step in and lay a new ground rule. And it happens at different ages. It could be a 5-year-old, it could be a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old. So each family's different, but you got to listen to the kids. They will express that. When it comes to sort of fighting fair, my husband always talks about, like, he and his brother always knew you don't hit in the face, like you hit in this place or that, but you don't hit in the face. So kids are able to negotiate rules for each other. And if you end up in a situation where there's always tears at the end of it, or there's always a screaming match at the end of it, that's a time when kids need help negotiating their rules. So it may start out great with laughter and all of that stuff, and it may devolve because one of them or both of them doesn't have the ability or capacity to sort of self-regulate. They get excited, they do something that's hurtful or painful. So making sure that they have the scaffolding and support to have that conversation, that negotiation. Ultimately, you want them to be able to do that without you.
That's
and
right.
I'll point you to our episode on siblings, which is a lot about when do you step in and when don't you step in? Because the goal down the line is for these kids to have independent relationships with each other where you're not in the middle of it and they're able to have these conversations, but they might need help over time, particularly if they're younger or there's kids for whom these kinds of conversations don't come naturally or more difficult. Maybe they have sensory issues. Maybe they're neurodiverse. There's all sorts of things that play into whether kids are capable of managing this dynamic on their own.
And I also would make a case for a PSA every once in a while, defining the behavior, like, hold up, guys. What's happening here right now where your hands are all over each other and you're in each other's spaces and you're not asking each other if it's okay. Like, I understand that this is something that you do as a form of play, but let's have a quick conversation about how this might impact you, what the consequences might be if it's not your sibling, but if it's someone else. And what you're looking for is the answer. Of course, I know that. This is what would happen to me. I can't do that. Okay,
Duh.
great. Duh.
Right. And
great.
Say that the time that I always consistently stepped in with my kids was when I heard one kid saying no to something and the other kid not stopping. And lest we gender that, I will tell you, it was often my daughter doing, the tickling or the squeezing or whatever, and my son saying no. So it's just a PSA about not gendering this stuff. It can be kids of any gender doing stuff to other kids of any gender. And I don't want to create the sort of male aggressor on female because it's different in every home, in schools too. The other boundary I think is super important to set is what language is acceptable, the jokes, the terminology, right? They're hearing so much stuff, even more than we did as kids because of everything from trolling on Roblox to videos on TikTok to influencers on YouTube. I mean, it's just an endless source of language that you actually really don't want your kid knowing or at least using.
I mean, how about separate from the language? How about just conceptually, when someone says something underneath your roof, whether it's two siblings in conversation or a friend who's over, and it is harassment, right? What is the refrain you hear so often in response? I was just joking.
Oh my
I was just
God.
joking. It was just a joke. And I think it's one thing when the kids are the kids who live under your roof or you're the trusted adult for those kids. It's very easy to step in and sort of define terms and say what isn't okay. It sometimes feels uncomfortable if there is another kid over and that's what's happening. And so, my advice is you could do a debrief after the play date is over. I strongly encourage that. Hey, what do you think I was thinking when I watched you and so have this conversation? And just to sort of, again, it's not a yes, no question. It is a guess what I'm thinking question. It is an interesting way to open the conversation and let them sort of reflect on. If you hear things that are really bothersome, there is no parent in the world who doesn't want to know when their kid needs help with their language. It's all about how you deliver the message. So there are ways to tell another parent that something happened in your house that sounds really judgmental and makes the parent feel very ashamed. And there are ways to tell that parent that are just, if and when this happens with my kid, I hope someone will pick up the phone and call me. I'm calling you. I think you have a great kid. This thing happened. I just wanted you to know about it.
Yeah. And if I hear stuff when my kids are hanging out and it's language that I've made explicitly clear is not to be used in my house, I'll say something to the group like, hey guys, just a reminder, we actually don't use those words in our house. And when you're under my roof, like, I don't want to hear that language. And I don't point it to one person. I don't ask them to leave. Although, so far I haven't been in a situation where I need to ask someone to leave, but I make the line clear. I make the line clear with my kids. I make the line clear when it's my kids and their friends. And again, it has to be consistent and ongoing because they are constantly exposed to new things, new language, new concepts, and it's really important. I want to close, Cara, with how we handle what kids are seeing online and how it shows up in real life.
Right. I mean, I was going to go right there because I hate to classify the things you hear or sort of witness as the easier things because they're hard.
Yeah.
But they are kind of easy compared to the messaging that kids are getting on their devices that you don't hear, you don't see. And yet those messages are being absorbed. And so let's go there.
Yeah. I mean, so as we've said many times before, the fifth grade group chat can be a toxic waste dump of behavior, trolling, harassment. This is where kids test out all sorts of comments, GIFs, memes, all sorts of stuff. So if you have a kid who has access to a device and is on a group chat, you kind of want to be spot checking that group chat periodically, either in case they're putting stuff in there that violates your family rules, or in case they're the victim of, or at least the witness of that behavior from someone else. So that's baseline group chat situation. If you have kids who have access to, different games like a Roblox or a Minecraft, if they have access to a YouTube or things where there's even more layers, where there are avatars, that becomes a place where there can be real trolling, where there can be sexual harassment, where there's all sorts of stuff that is way beyond what they should be exposed to. And frankly, they may not be able to even make sense of what they're seeing. And so again, spot checking, hey, let me sit with you while you play Roblox this weekend. Or, social media is filled with scary stories about what kids are exposed to on places like Roblox. A lot of different platforms have set up teen accounts or parent control. So I would definitely encourage people to go in and set up whatever parent controls are available to you. That doesn't guarantee your kid's not going to be exposed, but at least it creates some friction. But you really need to get eyes on what your kid is watching, seeing who they're interacting with. Are they interacting with strangers on some of these games, or are they just interacting in a gated pool of people who they know, who they've approved to be part of the game they're playing?
So there's so much that you can pick up when you do the visual spot check. There's also, if you're sitting here thinking, well, what happens if when I do the visual spot check, everything is kind of benign and I just am not checking at the moment where something pops in? And it's a fair question. And so to that end, there is a comment that we have tried to sort of hammer into the brains of parents and trusted adults for years when it comes to porn and porn viewing that I think very much applies here as well. And that is the mantra, you will never be in trouble for telling me what you saw. And I think to frame it with, hey, I'm not on every screen with you. There's a ton of incoming. It's overwhelming. Forget how old you are. For anyone of any age, it's overwhelming. I want you to be able to talk to me about stuff as it comes at you, because even though I'm going to help spot check, I won't always see what's coming at you. I will never be mad at you for what came at you and what you were managing. I will never be disappointed with you or upset with you when you share it with me. That's the only way I can help you sort through it. But here's the thing, Vanessa, then you have to follow through.
Right.
Because if you promise you will never be mad and they show you something, they volunteer it and they say, well, these people are saying this stuff online and I don't know, it sounds like coercion or harassment or whatever word they use. And you say, I can't believe you were on this game and blah, blah, blah. And I told you not to. And you're focused on whatever rule they broke. You've just lost your cred. And so I love empowering parents and trusted adults to say, I will never be mad at you. But then you have to be able to figure out, how do you split the difference? Because you're entitled to be mad. They're going to do things that you are going to be angry about. So figure it out. Figure out where that line is. It's going to take a lot of do-overs. It's going to take a lot of practice. But use that in the conversation. And maybe the place to land is the place that we started, which is, as your kids get older, one of the most fun things you can do is revisit the content from your own childhood through the lens of, I cannot believe this was okay at the time. It is bonding. It is funny. Sometimes your kid will be the one to say to you, are you kidding that this was okay? And it's an incredible moment because, as we have said for years, you can either laugh about this stuff or you can cry about this stuff. And it's more fun to laugh about it. And it gets you to the same end, which is acknowledging it and helping your kid sort of protect themselves from the forces of the world that are going to hand them consequences if they don't have this knowledge.
So everyone's homework assignment is to rewatch
16 Candles.
16 Candles with their kids this weekend and then have a conversation about it. Cara.
Except if your kid is like 8. Don't do that.
Yeah. Agreed. Cara, as ever, thank you for the convo.
Bye, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.